All right, everybody, welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. I'm your host, Scott Horton, and coming up in a minute, our next guest, Anthony Gregory from LouRockwell.com. I should say, if anybody wants to contact me, write me some hate mail or anything like that, it's scotthorton76@hotmail.com, Scott Horton, Horton, 76@hotmail.com. And I just bought the domain name weekendinterviewshow.com yesterday, although I don't have anything up on the site yet. Should get that going for you here pretty quickly, I hope. And anyways, I'm really glad to have Anthony Gregory on. I must say, full disclosure, he's become a good friend of mine. I interviewed him on my old radio show one time about the Bill of Rights, and we had a great discussion about how the current administration has violated every single one of them, although I guess they weren't in complete violation of the Third Amendment. The rest of them completely out the window. And then I went to the Libertarian Convention in Atlanta, Georgia at the end of May, and me and Anthony have become, or I should say, Anthony and I have become good friends since then, and I really enjoy the stuff he writes. He writes for LouRockwell.com, Antiwar.com, the Future of Freedom Foundation, the Independent Institute, Rational Review, the Libertarian Enterprise, and Strike the Root. And I would like to welcome Anthony Gregory to my very first show on the Republic Broadcasting Network.
Hi.
How are you doing today, my friend?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, well, it's my pleasure. I got to tell you, I was looking at the Future Freedom Foundation yesterday, and you wrote this killer article about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and I thought I'd start this interview off. Hopefully we can touch on all kinds of different issues and such, but I wanted to start off with the nuclear explosions in Japan in 1945. What's your basic premise you're trying to get across in that article, Anthony?
Well, my basic point was that the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki 59 years ago yesterday and Monday, and this Monday, were unnecessary to end the war. Japan was defeated. It was blockaded. It posed no threat against America at that point. And the killing of so many hundreds of thousands of civilians was unnecessary, and they were war crimes. And instead of learning from them that we should look back and see these cases where the U.S. government has killed thousands of innocent people and how that's often necessary, that shouldn't be the lesson, because that will guarantee future atrocities. We should look back at that and think about how horrible it was.
Yeah, unfortunately, I just heard that referred to as realism, that sometimes some got to die for some others.
Well, yeah, that's what they call it. It's easy to call it realism when you're not the one who's seeing his family get obliterated. When you're not the one who's worked your whole life to build up your business and to save your entire life, your life savings, to see it all destroyed, to see your arms and legs ripped off, or to see someone else's arms and legs ripped off. It's easier, but the realistic truth is that it wasn't necessary. Japan was ready to surrender. They had tried to surrender as early as May and in the next few months. They just didn't want the conditions of unconditional surrender, which were more or less unprecedented. It's kind of unreasonable to ask for unconditional surrender, because having already lost over 100 cities to the U.S. bombing, Tokyo and all the other cities that were firebombed, they didn't know what to expect from unconditional surrender, and neither did the Germans.
All right, we'll be right back. It's the Weekend Interview Show.
Public
All right, everybody, it's the Weekend Interview Show. I'm Scott Horton, and my guest this hour is Anthony Gregory. He writes for every libertarian, anything published anywhere. And just do a Google search for Anthony Gregory. You'll find some great stuff to read. We're talking about the anniversary of the nuking of Japan and unconditional surrender. Now, if I remember my history correct, the only condition that the Japanese were trying to hold on to was that they got to keep their emperor, right?
Well, that was definitely their major condition because, the emperor was their kind of figurehead and almost looked at religiously, and the thought of giving up their emperor to the U.S. was kind of scary. And we must remember that after World War I, when the Allies had defeated the Central Powers and they signed the Versailles Treaty, they imposed brutal sanctions on Germany, and it was really tough for Germany to rebuild its infrastructure, and everyone was afraid on both sides that if the other side won, it would just be total occupation and total dominance. So they were afraid of unconditional surrender. And I must mention that I'm not alone in the opinion that it wasn't necessary. At the time, many of Truman's advisors and top brass leaders were also very opposed to the dropping of the bomb. Dwight Eisenhower said that it was not necessary. Admiral William D. Leahy didn't think it was necessary. Former President Hoover didn't think it was necessary. Douglas MacArthur didn't think it was necessary. And the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey found that Japan would have surrendered probably no later than the end of 1945 without the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was an island nation. They didn't have any resources of their own. They had to import them, and they were completely blockaded. And the U.S. had the strongest navy in the world, and they had just beaten Germany. They could have used all of Germany's naval power too. It was completely unnecessary.
Well, and then we ended up letting them keep their emperor anyway.
That's true, we did. Now, of course, some will say that the emperor didn't have the same degree of authority afterwards, but it's hard to know what would have happened if it wasn't an unconditional surrender and they kept the emperor. It still wouldn't have been the same. The emperor still wouldn't have had the same power because it wouldn't have been an imperial power. Because it would have been defeated. They were utterly defeated.
I like your point about the false lesson learned from Hiroshima among defenders of that action. They always say that, well, first of all, that it had to be done or else the land invasion of Japan would have been such a disaster, and it ended up saving more lives and arguments like that. But then also, like, the lesson drawn, as you pointed out, that, hey, sometimes it's necessary to kill a few 100,000 people because there's some greater good that we're looking for here.
Yeah, that seems to be a scary lesson because I don't think, for one, that anyone should have the power that the presidents ever since Truman have had, the power to annihilate so much life at the click of a button. If there's any power that the founding fathers would have found just completely inappropriate for the president of a constitutional republic, the power over life and death over so many would be one of them, probably at the top of the list. And the idea that sometimes that's necessary, it's a very dangerous lesson to hold with us. And the U.S. has treated civilians almost completely indistinguishable from combatants in wars. In the Vietnam War during the 1990s and up to the Second Gulf War, the U.S. sanctions against Iraq had the explicit policy goal of starving and impoverishing the Iraqi people so they would rise up and defeat and overthrow Saddam. And, the estimates were that hundreds of thousands of innocent Iraqis died because of those sanctions. And when Madeleine Albright, Clinton's UN ambassador, was asked in 96 on 2020, or 60 Minutes, if that was a good price to pay, she said, yeah, the price is worth it. And, this is not the America that this country was supposed to be, and it's not a good America for the world to see. Killing tens and hundreds of thousands of civilians being necessary to oust Saddam, and has become what this is the logical implication of these original lessons that we supposedly learned. And of course, Truman's 1 million figure that he said 1 million people would have had, 1 million Americans would have died in an invasion. He just made that up. His military had estimated it might have been 20,000, maybe 40,000, but not 1 million. And as I said, an invasion was likely unnecessary as well because the island was blockaded.
You know, this goes to the kind of a larger theme of only war will prevent war and perpetual war for perpetual peace and that kind of thing. In fact, I think there's an exact quote of our president. In fact, I know it is because it's on one of my bumper stickers. It says, "The reason we start a war is to win a war and thereby have no more war."
Yeah, I've read that myself. I mean, it's a cliche these days to say that this is Orwellian. But these are Orwellian times. You hear this all the time coming from this administration. And of course, it's not just the Bush administration, though things have gotten pretty bad lately under Bush. It's both political parties. They're both about power, and they both love war because war, like nothing else, expands the power of the state over its own citizenry. It allows them to tax us more and regulate the economy more and strip away our civil liberties.
In fact, you wrote a piece called "Kerry Would Rather Lose Than Be Against the War."
Oh yeah, there's this misconception. It's among conservatives who support this war, and you have to say that because some conservatives oppose this war. But a lot of conservatives point out that Kerry's supposedly this pansy who won't know how to wage war, and he's against the war deep inside. Well, I doubt it. He's never said anything substantially against this war. He voted for the war. In the late 90s, he voted to give Clinton the authority to go to war if he wanted to, and he supported that resolution. With or without UN approval, Kerry's always supported war with Iraq. He just wants to do it himself, and he doesn't want Bush to do it because he's not a Democrat. Bush isn't. But Kerry supports war up and down, and I think that it's in some ways he's more supportive of war. He says that Bush isn't to be faulted for doing too much in the war on terror, but rather too little. And this idea that Kerry is some sort of peacenik is a lie that both conservatives and many on the left believe. It's just like the fib that the conservatives support smaller government and lower taxes. This is just a distraction so they could divide us into groups of people who fear one type of government policy over another. But both parties are identical.
Well, I can understand how people would make that mistake. I mean, it's not like the Democrats have been the party of peace or anything, but I can see how, for people who aren't really politically informed, how they would think, well, you know, if Bush is the war hawk and John Kerry's the other guy, then Kerry must be the peace guy, because everybody knows that war and peace is the most important thing this year. So if there's two guys running, they must have opposite opinions on that. You know what I mean? I could see how they would come to that conclusion if without evidence.
Yeah, it's just the assumption. It's the somewhat uneducated assumption that I think allows the government to further rule our lives and take more and more of our income and further destroy the economy. It's the two parties like to pretend that there's differences between them, but there aren't. Not really. I mean, and you hear the hypocrisy coming from conservatives who will, on the one hand, say that the liberals will come in and then we'll lose the war because they won't know how to stand up in the war, but on the other hand, they'll cite Clinton's war-making as a sign of the left's hypocrisy. And they're right that the left has been hypocritical at times in their either passiveness or outright support for Clinton's terrible bombings of Serbia and his foreign adventures. But both parties are interventionist. Certainly the Democrats are not a peace party. They haven't been since Woodrow Wilson.
Oh, were they then? I thought he was the guy that got us into the war.
Yeah, they haven't been since Woodrow Wilson took power. And
oh, okay. I thought you were saying since his administration. What?
No. He probably did more than anything else to solidify the U.S. as an interventionist power in the world. And of course, the Truman that I was criticizing harshly earlier, he was a Democrat. And Dennis Kucinich, the Democratic candidate that didn't have any chance, the peace candidate who seemed somewhat sincere in his opposition to this war, his favorite presidents, one of the two is Truman. And it seems kind of odd to me for someone who opposes war to support a guy who ended one war with nuclear weapons and started another war with Korea.
Yeah, well, anyway, you shouldn't go looking too deep for consistency among Democrats, Anthony. You're going to learn that as you get a little older.
Probably. Yeah, there is no consistency. Both parties are war parties. They're both big spending welfare parties. They both love to tax our income, regulate the economies. They both love to shred the Bill of Rights. They both, you mentioned that we had discussed how Bush had shredded the entire Bill of Rights, and that's true. The Republicans don't stand for our liberty any better than the Democrats do.
Hey, it's the Weekend Interview Show. If anybody wants to get involved on the air, the number is 1-800-313-9443. 800-313-9443. I'm Scott Horton. My guest is Anthony Gregory, and it's the Weekend Interview Show on the Republic Broadcasting Network. Everybody, it's the Weekend Interview Show. I'm Scott Horton, and it's my very first show on the Republic Broadcasting Network. My guest is Anthony Gregory. He writes for Strike the Root, LouRockwell.com, Antiwar.com, the Future Freedom Foundation, Libertarian Enterprise, Rational Review, and the Independent Institute. So please check out all of Anthony's wonderful writings. You want to take some phone calls, Anthony?
Sure. I might as well mention, since you named everything there, that I also write for Liberty Magazine.
Oh, Liberty Magazine as well. All right, my bad. All right, hey, let's go to Shauna here in Austin.
Hi. I noted earlier that you mentioned Eisenhower, MacArthur, and a number of important figures of that time were against the dropping of the bomb or said it was not necessary. So was Truman himself personally hot to do this, or was there someone we know about who was pulling his strings in this matter?
Well, Truman appears to be the most behind it. He had some advisors who probably supported it. I think there was one that was.
I know Henry Stimson played a great part in that.
Yeah. Stimson, I think, supported it, but one top guy resigned. But we can say that it was Truman's decision. And it was his main decision, and he was the one who obviously could have not done it. And he was the one who did do it in spite of so many people wanting to do it. But, of course, some people supported it, and I wasn't trying to imply that there was universal opposition to it, but there was certainly not universal support for it.
Who is Henry Stimson?
I believe he was the Secretary of War before they
made
that the Secretary of Defense.
Yeah, so certainly I wouldn't want to create the false impression that that Truman was the only one in the entire government. His War Department supported it, but many of the actual military leaders opposed it.
Oh, that's sort of the same thing going on right now with the invasion of Iraq, where the civilians who've never carried a gun before, they're all for the war, while the people in the military are trying their best to at least delay it, if not stop it entirely.
Yeah, the military tends to be a little bit more reluctant to go to war and to be involved in war than the civilian leadership.
Shauna, did you have another question? Oh, she's gone.
No, I guess I guess I'm good. I would like to probably know more about who the advisors were that were behind it and what their other political connections were. Basically, were they connected to the banking elite of the time who were pulling strings in the direction of war?
Well, I would say that regardless of anyone's motivation, kind of ulterior motivations, the biggest motivation at the time was simply the absolute power that Truman himself had, even outside of any kind of backdoor motivation. I mean,
shock and awe, sort of, huh?
Yeah, it was just an incredible thing. I mean, historians have debated for the last 50 years, why did he do it assuming it wasn't necessary? And some people thought it was to impress Stalin or even to preempt a Russian invasion of Japan and, kind of start the Cold War off with a bang. It's kind of gruesome, but that's one idea. I don't know. I can't retroactively read his mind, but I know that he did it, and it doesn't appear to have been necessary. And I think that we shouldn't go into these histories assuming that it's necessary to kill so many innocent people, because that really dooms the future.
Thank you very much for the call, Shauna.
All right, thank you. Bye.
If anybody else wants to get involved on the air, it's 800-313-9443. I'm Scott Horton, and my guest is Anthony Gregory. Now, Anthony, everybody around here and, probably all over the country was just absolutely freaking out a few weeks ago when this guy, I forget his name, decided that he ought to have the power to suspend the election if necessary. And then I go to LouRockwell.com and there's a column by my buddy Anthony saying, "Oh man, I wish they would. I can see all kinds of wonderful silver linings in the suspension of the presidential election this year." What the hell are you talking about?
Well, first a small amount of background here. There's another good writer on Lou Rockwell, Bob Murphy, and he wrote an article about canceling the elections and how bad it would be. And I wrote at least a somewhat tongue-in-cheek, somewhat satirical article where I gave the so-called silver linings, and that was I was borrowing that idea from another writer, Walter Block, who always talks about the silver linings in these things that most people would consider bad. But then Bob Murphy actually replied to my article this weekend and said, no, it really would be bad. So I don't want to give the false impression that if the elections were canceled, everything would be great. That would probably coincide with a lot of real bad things happening. But I think that in a sense, the elections are a joke. They don't seem to
Hold that thought, Anthony. We'll be right back after this break.
You're listening to the Republic Broadcasting Network, because you can handle the truth.
All right, everybody, welcome back to the Weekend Interview Show. I'm your host, Scott Horton, and on the phone is Anthony Gregory, who writes for many, many different libertarian websites and print magazines, including LouRockwell.com, StrikeTheRoot.com, Liberty Magazine, Rational Review, etc., etc. And when we left off before the break there, Anthony, you were describing how you took Walter Block's lead and decided to look for the silver linings of the suspended election.
Well, the main point that I was making is that whoever we elect, and you know that when you vote, you're only voting with about 100 million other people, and whenever it comes close, then it doesn't really matter because it's just up to the state legislature, the Supreme Court, or whoever has the final say. But even if you take for granted that your vote means something in the major election between parties, the two parties are so identical and they do the same stuff to us. You could vote against Bush and for Kerry because you don't like the war or you don't like his foreign policies, but you'll probably get more of the same. And you could vote against Kerry because you're afraid of expanding welfare programs, but that's exactly what we're getting with Bush. So that was my main point, that maybe people would wake up and realize they don't have any control over their government in spite of the election.
That would definitely be a silver lining.
That would be a silver. I don't know if I'd actually support it or oppose it if they wanted to cancel the elections, but it would happen in such a chaotic time that it'd be hard to analyze it.
Yeah, well, I plan on showing up and voting my conscience like I always do and vote for the Libertarians.
Well, yeah, if you're going to vote, you should definitely vote for your conscience and not for the lesser of two emperors, because you're going to get the same results with the two big parties anyway. Oh, during the break, I looked up this quote from Eisenhower, and he was talking about his discussion with Secretary of War Stimson, who, as we were discussing, did support the bombing very adamantly. And if this sounds kind of like an understatement, but it's worth sharing. Eisenhower talks about how he was discussing with Stimson the bombing and how he didn't think it was necessary, and he says, "The secretary was deeply perturbed by my attitude."
Yeah. What do you mean you don't want to kill a bunch of people with a nuclear bomb? or did they still pronounce it nuclear back then?
Nuclear.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, I read a quote somewhere where Truman talked about, well, let's just hope that God gives us the wisdom to use the atom bomb as he would have us use it. Yeah,
that seems a little bit, I'm not one to write people out of religions and say that they don't believe what they claim they believe, but that doesn't seem to be the Prince of Peace's policy towards innocent men, women, and children.
You wrote in your the thing about the silver linings. You wrote the biggest mistake one of the biggest mistakes in U.S. history was giving women the vote.
Well, yeah, but you got to say it in context. That's not all I said. I said we should have taken it away from men and then told the politicians to pack their bags and go home. If we have a vote, I certainly think that women should vote as well as men. But voting just creates this illusion that we really control the government, and we've moved more towards mass democracy in the history. And we were meant to be a republic that was constitutionally limited. So even if people voted for some really terrible leader, he wouldn't be able to do much harm. Of course, now if we vote for a really terrible leader, we end up with
terrible leadership.
Terrible leadership that has a lot of power, like we have these last 4 years and the 8 years before that and the 4 years before that. And, you could go on.
Yeah, and you can keep on going back too.
I want to live in a country where the government is so restrained that it doesn't matter if Bill Clinton or George Bush is president. I mean, maybe one will lead a slightly more corrupt post office or whatever the Constitution allows the government to do, but it won't mean life and death, and it won't mean so much of the economy being destroyed and regulated.
In fact, you've even proposed actual constitutional methods for, I guess, basically reversing the direction of that mass democracy that you're talking about when a column you wrote called The Libertarian Constitutional Amendments. The first two, you say, repeal the 16th and 17th Amendments. I guess that would be a pretty good start, huh?
Yeah, those two amendments happened around the same time, in 1913, and they really changed the constitutional structure. The 16th Amendment, of course, started income tax on the federal level. We had federal income tax under Lincoln and during other times, but the Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional. Now, I've gotten in arguments with people who say the 16th Amendment doesn't really establish the income tax and all of this, but the end result seems to be an income tax. And so I think the 16th Amendment should go. And the 17th we used to have the senators chosen by the state legislatures, which kind of gave the states one more check in the checks and balances. And by making them directly elected, we certainly haven't reduced corruption in the Senate, but it's just further weakened the position that states had in relation to the federal government.
You also propose a new amendment, one of them, the Jury Enforcement of the Bill of Rights Amendment. What's that like?
Well, the Bill of Rights isn't any good if it's not enforced, and I believe the Bill of Rights should be enforced. I believe when the government violates the Bill of Rights, they're breaking the law. But so far, having the government enforce the Bill of Rights doesn't seem to work very well, and I don't see how it could work. Juries are they at least have they're supposed to be the last check on government repression, you know. The legislature passes a law, the executive has to sign it and then enforce it, the courts have to say it's okay, and then when someone's accused of breaking the law, the jury is supposed to decide one way or the other if the person's guilty, and also whether the law is itself constitutional and just. For 1,000 years in common law, juries had the right to nullify laws. Now judges don't tell them that. And in some cases, if the juries, when they're in deliberation, one of the jurors points out that that's their right and their duty, they'll be thrown out or even held in contempt. So the idea was just to make it clear in the Constitution that this was the jurors' rights and that the jurors should, if someone's being accused of a crime, they should let him go if the law is repugnant to the Constitution. If a government official is accused of violating the Constitution, that should be considered a crime. And if someone's defending himself from a government agent who's considerably violating the Bill of Rights, then that should be a defense, too.
Sure, you also propose a peace amendment to the Constitution. What are the particulars of that?
Well, I've heard a lot of people suggest peace amendments. And, anything that would further restrain our government's war-making powers is good. But mine's pretty sweeping because it says that, and of course there's no chance that this will ever be brought up in state legislatures. This is all just a fundamental exercise. But I think that if wars had to be voted on by Congress, congressional declaration of war, ideally then it should go to a popular vote, and everyone who votes yes should have to enlist in the military and fund the war on their own.
Yeah. Of course. That's an individualist's approach to war between nation states, right?
Yeah, and anytime anytime you're attacked, people are going to fight back. The American Revolution was won largely by militias and by private. People are willing to help to defend their homes and their neighborhoods and their communities. It's when you have these strange nation-building and nation-destroying adventures, and you have, the war in Iraq and the war in Serbia, that people don't really know if they support it. And I don't think they should have to pay for it, and they shouldn't have to. The war shouldn't be waged in their name if it's not in their name. This is ideal, though, of course.
I'm Scott Horton, and this is the Weekend Interview Show. My guest is Anthony Gregory, who writes for LouRockwell.com. The phone number is 1-800-313-9443. Let's talk to Jack.
Come on.
You're on the air, Jack.
Yeah, Scott, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you, sir?
Doing good. It's been a while.
Yes, I think I remember you.
Yeah, it's been a while. It's good to hear you back on. I know you're going to be a big addition to the lineup here.
Oh, thank you very much for saying so.
Kind of interested in the World War II discussion about the necessity or to drop the bomb there. I have a unique perspective on that incident.
How so?
My father was on a ship heading for Japan. He was infantry stationed in Hawaii, and his unit was heading for their first military engagement. Had that bomb not been dropped.
Anthony, what do you say to that?
I understand what you're saying. I've talked to historian. He's I'll say historian Robert Stinnett, who wrote Day of Defeat. And I was talking to him about this, and he was also in the Pacific. And had there been an invasion, he might have had to go, and he might have had to give us life. And certainly that'd be a terrible thing. And I could understand why anyone with kind of a first-hand perspective coming from there would believe that the bombing at least saved them or their loved ones. But as I said, I don't think even invasion was necessary, and because it was the island was blockaded. Even if invasion was necessary, it does create a bad precedent to kill hundreds of thousands of civilians to save tens of thousands of combatants, because combatants are the ones who, in the theoretical just war doctrine, are the ones who are supposed to fight. Now, I certainly don't think that the combatants who were, especially when they were drafted, and millions of Americans were drafted during the war, I don't think that their lives are any less important. But I don't think that the innocent people's lives were any less important. And I think that invasion and bombing could have both been avoided if the U.S. had just stayed the course and kept the blockade up. And Japan certainly posed no more threat to America. Japan wasn't going to fly over and bomb Pearl Harbor again.
Jack, what do you say?
I get most of my information from William Manchester. Are you familiar with him?
I'm afraid not.
Okay, Manchester was he was one of the press men in the Kennedy administration. He's written a 2-volume narrative history of America. It's called The Glory and the Dream. And he's got the whole story about the dropping of the bomb. They only had 2 bombs. So.
All right. Well, I'll be sure to look that up. We're almost out of time. We got a couple more calls to get to here, Jack. So I'm going to have to cut it off here. But please give a call. Stay tuned to the show. Hopefully, it should be here every Saturday from 3 to 5, I think. And let's go to DJ in Illinois.
That's good to hear another one on Republic. We came across Republic a couple weeks ago.
Oh.
And I've got 3 questions, and then you decide which you choose to respond to.
Okay, great.
We're having difficulty as to where we get legitimate historical facts and legitimate, accurate copies of the old documents that verify how bogus the history taught in the public schools really are. Second question, what do you guys think about the paper ballot drive with all precincts being counted for this election, especially for the state ones, the senatorial, the county levels?
Mm-hmm.
And then my last one, actually, I should say the reason we started digging was my younger 2 are in the military. One was overseas and one is now in Iraq. And the reports I'm hearing are not good. We also have other family members in the military, many, many veterans. And we really don't like being lied to. I bring up one of the draft bills. Senate 89 is the only one that I have read cover to cover. And as I recall, not only does it say that everybody 18 to 26 serves for 2 years, it also transfers authority from Congress to whoever's got their rear parked in the Oval Office, as well as I think the cabinet ones were Secretary of Defense and Homeland Security, if you call it security.
All right. Well, let's see if we can tackle these. Let's see. First of all, books. Anthony, where can DJ find some good revisionist history?
Well, history is a tough thing because you can't just find there's no one book that will have American history without any distortions. And certainly I'm not the biggest expert on all of American history, but of all of the books I've read, you have to look at a lot of stuff and kind of filter it. But there's on World War II, I would recommend there's a book by Richard Mayberry called World War II, The Rest of the Story and How It Affects You Today. And
Mayberry.
It's written
M-A-Y-B-E-R-R-Y?
Maybury. And it's written in a very accessible, kind of simple way, but it's got a lot of really good stuff in it, and it has a good bibliography. There's lots of good bibliographies online, which if you go to onpower.org, onpower.org, there's long bibliographies on much of American history. And if you go to LouRockwell.com, they have some really good bibliographies too. On their main page, I think, if you click bibliographies.
Okay, we got about a minute here before the next break. So really quickly, I know I can speak for Anthony and say if there is going to be an election, yes, it must be paper ballots as well as electronic voting machines so that there can be real verification of how people voted. And on conscription, Anthony, I'll let you take this one, my friend.
Well, I'm frightened that we're going to have another draft, and certainly no one opposes the draft more than I do. As a libertarian, I consider it a form of slavery. And yes, the Senate and the House have introduced bills, and just like most of the wartime measures of recent years, the president would call the shots. So it's scary. Will it happen? I don't think we can know for sure.
All right, hang tight, everybody. We'll be right back. Carol, hang on the line. We'll get right to you. It's the Weekend Interview Show on the Republic Broadcasting Network. All right, everybody, we're back for the Weekend Interview Show. I'm your host, Scott Horton. This is my very first show on the Republic Broadcasting Network, and I'm very happy to be here. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today. My guest today, or this hour, is Anthony Gregory. He writes for LouRockwell.com, Antiwar.com, the Future Freedom Foundation, the Independent Institute, Rational Review, the Libertarian Enterprise, StrikeTheRoot.com, and Liberty Magazine. And we're wrapping up a couple of phone calls in this last segment here, so let's go ahead and go to Carol in Idaho. Hi, Carol.
Hello. Hi, Scott. Anthony.
Hi.
Hey, that's a very good first show for you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that very much, Carol.
Two things quickly. One or the other of you mentioned Dennis Kucinich.
Yes.
And you also mentioned peace movement, which I think is very interesting because a few years ago, Dennis Kucinich put forth in Congress a peace amendment. He had a bill by that name. I read it. Thanks to Bernadine Smith, who sent us a copy from the Second Amendment Committee there in Concord, California, I believe. Anyway, it's worth reading. Pull up on the Internet, Peace Movement or Dennis Kucinich, and you'll find what he's saying. There's never been a worse misnomer except maybe the Patriot Act. I mean, it is anything but peace. Okay, now the second thing I want to mention is anyone who has access to the Internet, pull up Patriot Politicians Lead Wars. And all this means is it's an organization, some active and retired military have come up with this plan that any congressperson or any government person, president or anybody, who wants to push for a war or vote for a draft, they better be ready to go and serve in the front lines, foot soldier fashion themselves. Anyway, I'll repeat that. Patriot Politicians Lead Wars. And you can get a hard copy as well as getting the scoop on the Internet there.
Great. Thank you very much, Carol.
God bless.
That's funny. I saw an Onion headline about George W. Bush bravely leads 3rd Infantry into battle. Did you see that? Anyways, all right, let's talk to Will in Hutto, Texas.
How you doing? Scott.
Welcome to the show, sir.
Hey, Scott, I want to tell you it's great to be on. I just discovered the Republic Broadcasting Network several months ago, and I am extremely impressed with your show. You've had some great guests, and your handling of them has been very informed and professional.
Well,
and I appreciate that. And I'm impressed with Anthony as well. I am a book collector, and I collect primarily old history books, and I have a certain interest in geopolitics, and I studied...
Hurry up, we're almost out of time here.
Right. I have speeches from some of the politicians of the 30s and 40s, and Truman was already, by the time he reached national office as vice president, was already a committed communist, an ideological communist. He, as well as Thomas E. Dewey.
Oh, sure. He's the guy who sent Harry Dexter White, the Soviet agent, to create the Bretton Woods Agreement. I'm sorry to hang up on you, Will, but we're just completely out of time here. Feel free to call back next week. You can always email me, Scott Horton, Horton, Scott Horton 76 at hotmail.com. And please, everybody, I encourage you to look up Anthony Gregory. He sounds smart. Just wait till you read what he writes. It's incredible. So that's it, everybody. Thanks for listening to the Weekend Interview Show.
Thanks, Scott.
Thank you.
You're listening to the Republic Broadcasting Network, because you can handle the truth.